Everyone's thinking about the question of which candidate for president is better for the economy in completely the wrong way. First, let's take a listen to this clip of former President Barack Obama slamming Trump's record on the economy.
Some people think, wow, I don't know, I remember that economy when he first came in being pretty good. Yeah, it was pretty good, because it was my economy. We had 75 straight months of job growth that I handed over to him. It wasn't something he did.
So is Obama right? Did Trump inherit his good economy? Well, let's take a look at that. I want to start by showing you this chart of the US unemployment rate, typically the single most important metric when it comes to judging the health of the US economy. If a lot of people are unemployed, that's obviously a bad sign for the economy. On the other hand, if there's not a whole lot of unemployment, that's usually a good sign. So Trump became president in January 2017, right about here when the unemployment rate was 4.7%. But as you can see, the unemployment rate had been declining for 7 years prior to Trump becoming president, a period when Obama was president. During Obama's presidency, the unemployment rate fell from 7.8% to 4.7%. So that might be what Obama's talking about. Trump became president after the unemployment rate had already fallen significantly during the Obama years. It's also true, though, that during Trump's presidency, the unemployment rate continued to fall, reaching a low of 3.5% in September of 2019. And that was actually a 50-year low in the unemployment rate at that time, a very, very low unemployment rate. But who deserves credit for that, Obama or Trump? I'm going to get back to that. First, though, let's finish the story. The 50-year low in the unemployment rate that was reached in 2019 didn't last for long. Several months later, the unemployment rate saw one of its largest increases in history, reaching 15% in early 2020. By the time Trump left office in January of 2021, the unemployment rate was 6.4%, down from those extremely lofty levels of 2020, but still much higher than when he entered office. Now, of course, the increase in the unemployment rate was primarily due to the COVID pandemic, so it's probably not right to blame that on Trump. And a lot of Trump supporters will eagerly point that out. Instead, they'll tell you to look at what the economy was doing in late 2019, before the pandemic. And as we just saw, the unemployment rate was 3.5% back then, which is fantastic. But again, who deserves credit for that? Obama, under whose presidency the unemployment rate fell from 7.8% to 4.7%, or Trump, under whose presidency it fell from 4.7% to 3.5%? We still need more context before we can answer that question. So far, we've looked at the unemployment rate, but that's just one economic metric. It's a very important metric, but it's just one piece of the economic puzzle. There are many other criteria you could judge the economy on. In fact, there's one other metric that has overshadowed the jobs market over the past few years, and that's inflation. In 2021 and 2022, the US experienced some of the highest rates of inflation in decades, pushing up the price of everything from food to vehicles to houses. This is at the heart of why I think so many people feel nostalgic about the Trump economy. They remember the period of his presidency as being a time when prices were lower and more stable. But before you give credit to Trump for that, take a look at this chart. This shows the rate of inflation by year. And what you'll notice is that low inflation isn't solely a Trump phenomenon. We've had low inflation for much of the past few decades. In fact, the inflation rate was lower during Obama's 2 terms than it was under Trump's 1 term. Inflation was actually so low during Obama's time that there were concerns about deflation or falling prices, but that's a completely separate topic. Now, as you're probably aware, that long stretch of low inflation ended in 2021, and a lot of people like to blame Joe Biden for causing the spike in prices. I think that's misguided, and this next chart really illustrates why that is. This shows the rate of inflation in some of the biggest economies in the world, and what you'll notice is that inflation spiked across all of them at the same time. That is not a coincidence. The pandemic caused massive shifts in the global economy that strained supply chains. When you suddenly had billions of people cooped up at home, that created all sorts of imbalances in the demand for goods versus services. You add the war in Ukraine on top of that, which disrupted the supply of key commodities, and you had the perfect storm which caused inflation to rise all across the world. So contrary to what some people would have you believe, Biden didn't cause inflation to rise in the US. In fact, blaming the rise in inflation on Biden would be like blaming Trump for the rise in the unemployment rate during his presidency, even though we know it was largely due to COVID. Both would be unfair. Okay, so now that we have that context, I want to make a few points. The first is, as I've alluded to, there isn't one singular economic metric that can tell us how healthy the economy is. You could look at the unemployment rate and inflation as we've done, but you could also look at GDP, GDP per capita, disposable income, and even the stock market. Each of those metrics could tell you a different story about the economy. There are countless economic metrics out there, and different people will have different opinions about which are the most important. The second point I want to make is that the president's impact on some of these broad economic metrics is pretty limited in the short term. Longer term, the story is a little bit different, as I'll talk about, but short term, the president can do very little to impact the unemployment rate, the GDP growth rate, or the inflation rate. And that's because most of the factors that drive these metrics is outside the president's control. The US has a mixed capitalist economic system. Market forces, the collective action of hundreds of millions of people, determines how the economy fares. The government influences that system through regulations and legislation, and the president has a hand in shaping those regulations and legislation. But in any given year, factors outside of the president's control are going to dictate what the economy does. Things like technological progress, business and consumer confidence, and monetary policy are going to have a greater effect on the economy than what the president does. Usually, these factors work in favor of the economy. The most likely outcome in any given year is for the economy to grow and for people to become wealthier. Occasionally, though, there are economic downturns, which are completely natural to see in a market-based economy. But even though the president's impact on the economy is limited in the short term, presidents often do get credited or blamed for what happens with the economy in the relatively short period of time that they're in office. And in my opinion, that's a big flaw with how much of the media and public analyzes a president's economic policies. They'll look at things like GDP growth or the unemployment rate during a president's 4 or 8 year term and judge their policies based on that. Just this past week, the Wall Street Journal put out a story comparing the economy under Trump versus under Biden based on how metrics like GDP, inflation, and the unemployment rate did during their respective terms. But as I just talked about, that's not the right way to look at things. In fact, it's silly to look at under which president GDP grew the fastest or inflation was the lowest. It's not like the president has a magic wand they can wave on their first day of office to dramatically change things with the economy. So yes, the jobs market improved under Obama and got even stronger under Trump and Biden. And yes, inflation was low under Obama and Trump and then went up under Biden. But they really didn't have anything to do with that. That doesn't mean, though, that the president has no impact. The US economic system is the most important thing when it comes to the performance of the economy. But like I said, the president has a hand in shaping the system that we have, and depending on what they do, the long-term consequences could be really big. The president's impact usually comes in the form of legislation, regulations, and executive actions. But even foreign policy and immigration policy can have significant effects. In general, recent Republican presidents have favored lower taxes and fewer regulations. They've tended to see free markets as the engine which drives economic growth and prosperity. And therefore, they usually implement policies that encourage the free market to operate with minimal government intervention. Meanwhile, recent Democratic presidents have also been proponents of free markets, but they've tended to favor higher taxes on the wealthy to fund social programs and to reduce income inequality, as well as more guardrails on the capitalist system to ensure that it serves the broader interests of society and to protect vulnerable populations. Because the party in power changes from one election to the next, we tend to go back and forth between greater government involvement and a more hands-off approach. Additionally, some presidents take more forceful actions to accomplish their goals, while others make more incremental changes. Sometimes the actions a president takes are reversed by future presidents, while other times the impact is longer lasting. So there's a lot of things to consider as we analyze economic policy. Okay, so let's make this a little bit more concrete by talking about some of the big economic policies that were enacted by recent US presidents, starting with Barack Obama. The centerpiece of Obama's economic legacy is the Affordable Care Act. Popularly known as Obamacare, the law expanded health insurance coverage to tens of millions of Americans. It was funded by slightly raising taxes on high-income earners and putting fees on health insurance companies. Obama's successor, Donald Trump, tried to repeal Obamacare many times, but he was never successful, and the law largely remains intact today. This is an example of a law that, at least so far, has stood the test of time. Another signature piece of legislation that Obama signed into law was the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, a law designed to increase oversight of the financial services industry. This law was essentially Obama's answer to the housing bust and financial crisis, which had pushed the US economy into its worst downturn since the Great Depression back in 2008. A lot of people blame that crisis on a lack of regulatory oversight, which allowed big banks and other financial institutions to take on too much risk. Most people today believe that the Dodd-Frank reforms have been a success, though parts of the law have been repealed by a law that Trump passed during his term. And that illustrates the back and forth nature of regulations. One president decreases regulations and another president increases regulations, and we kind of go back and forth like a pendulum. The last piece of Obama's economic legacy that I want to talk about are his spending cuts. Though he was kind of strong-armed into it, together with the Republican Congress, Obama helped cut deficits by 2/3 compared to where they were when he first entered office. But those deficit reductions were reversed under the Trump and Biden administration. So there was really no lasting impact there. And we really haven't had a president that's made deficit reduction a central part of their economic platform in a really long time. Okay, so we've covered Obama. His successor, of course, was Donald Trump, whose signature piece of legislation was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a law which reduced taxes for individuals and corporations with the aim of increasing economic growth and making the US a more attractive place to invest. Those tax cuts are still intact today, but many of them, including the ones for individuals like you and me, are set to expire next year. The tax cuts for corporations are permanent, though in theory they could be increased in the future with new legislation. In general, the verdict on the tax cuts has been mixed. There's evidence that some corporations increased their investments in America after the law was passed, but the overall impact on economic growth has been relatively modest. Alright, so the tax cuts were the most significant piece of legislation passed under Trump, but in my opinion, his most consequential impact on the economy wasn't his tax cuts. It was his trade philosophy. Trump came into office absolutely gung-ho about how other countries, and particularly China, were ripping off the US. That they were stealing our jobs, our industries, and our intellectual property by using unfair trade practices. His solution to this was to put large tariffs on goods made in China so that they're more expensive to buy. This, he said, would A, encourage China to make a trade deal that would make the playing field between the two countries more fair, and B, encourage companies to produce goods in the US instead of China. I say that when it comes to the economy, this is the most consequential thing Trump did when he was president, because his approach to trade with China is something that completely upended the status quo that existed for years before he came to office and effectively became the new norm. President Biden has largely left Trump's China tariffs in place, and he's instituted new trade restrictions on the country as well. In general, both major US political parties have come to see China as an economic adversary that must be defeated. And that all really started with Trump. That said, in typical Trump fashion, the ex-president has promised that if he becomes president again, he's going to take things to another level by putting even larger tariffs on China, something like 60% on all Chinese goods. Not only that, he wants to raise tariffs across the board on all US imports, no matter where they come from. These types of draconian tariff policies aren't very popular today, even within Trump's own party. But who knows? Trump shifted the narrative on China and on trade once, maybe he can do it again. Regardless, tariffs are an area where the president can take unilateral action. So if he becomes president again, there's a very good chance that Trump uses tariffs to achieve his economic goals. Okay, next up we have Joe Biden, the current president of the United States. Biden has helped pass a number of big consequential pieces of legislation, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which provides hundreds of billions of dollars to modernize America's roads, bridges, public transit, and broadband infrastructure. This is one of those bills that has long-lasting impact. It's not going to be reversed by a future president, and these infrastructure investments should in theory pay dividends for years to come. Another big economic bill signed by Biden is the CHIPS and Science Act, which provides billions of dollars of tax cuts and subsidies to incentivize companies to bring chip manufacturing back to the US and to bolster America's science and technology infrastructure. This again is another bill with long-lasting implications. There are already chip manufacturing plants being built on US soil because of this bill. Last but not least, another one of Biden's big economic achievements is the Inflation Reduction Act, which has less to do with inflation and more to do with climate change. The law provides hundreds of billions of dollars of federal funding for clean energy industries like solar and electric vehicles. It also encourages companies to upgrade America's energy infrastructure. To be fair, the IRA does have some key features that are designed to reduce some prices. Specifically, it allows the government to negotiate with drug companies to lower drug prices on behalf of those on Medicare. This is a pretty bold step, and like Obamacare, it's an example of the government getting more involved in the healthcare industry to benefit certain groups of people. Anyway, as you can see, Biden has been very successful in implementing his economic agenda, which is heavy on industrial policy. His goal has been to rejuvenate manufacturing in the US, strengthen supply chains, and to invest in what he calls the industries of the future. Many of the laws he's helped pass will have long-lasting impact, though it remains to be seen whether they'll be successful in achieving his aims. Alright, so I've talked about Obama, Trump, and Biden. Now I should probably talk about Kamala Harris as well. Unlike the three guys I just talked about, she's never been president, so we don't know exactly what she would do if she were president. I'd imagine though that she'll have similar policy goals as Biden and most other Democrats as well. Where it looks like she wants to make more of an impact is on housing affordability. She has said that she wants to incentivize the construction of millions of new homes while offering down payment assistance to first-time homebuyers. Whether we see anything like that will depend on her first getting elected and then having the votes in Congress to pass the legislation that she wants. Anyway, I know this video has been pretty long, but I think the key takeaway from all this is that assessing which president or which presidential candidate is better for the economy or has a better economic record takes a more nuanced analysis than you tend to find out there. People are usually focused on the wrong things. Big, broad economic metrics like GDP and inflation over relatively short periods of time are not what you want to look at. You want to look at specific policies that a president has enacted or policy goals that a presidential candidate has. And if those policies are successfully implemented, you want to see how they impact the metrics that you want them to impact over a long period of time. You also want to look at things that aren't normally considered economic policy, but which could have big consequences for the economy. Things like immigration policy, which impacts the labor market and the demographics of the country. Even geopolitics, something seemingly as benign as letting China enter the World Trade Organization at the turn of the century, eventually led to that country becoming a manufacturing powerhouse to the benefit of US consumers and to the detriment of the US manufacturing industry. A president's temperament and leadership abilities matter too. I talked about how regulatory failures helped to create the housing bubble, which then burst and ignited the financial crisis. Even though that crisis began at the tail end of the Bush presidency, he had the right team in place to begin diffusing the crisis. And similarly, Obama put in place the right people to help start turning the economy around in 2009. So I'll leave it there. I hope you got something out of this video. That's it for now. I'll catch you in the next one.